everyone. Thanks for coming to my talk. I'm Dora Militaru. I'm a JavaScript developer, mostly. And I work in London for a news organization called the Financial Times. And I'm really happy to say that our journalism is still respected globally for its integrity and accuracy and authority. And I'm always happy when our paper gets handed out on a plane. It's my first time in Madrid, and I am super honored to be here talking to you. I love Madrid. You can see me enjoying various fancy drinks around town, and also it's been amazing to have all the engagement from the community on Twitter. I've been invited to a meetup tonight. I'm super excited about my visit. I arrived yesterday. I arrived from a little jaunt in Russia. So I went to Siberia and I went to St. Petersburg. You can imagine how happy I am to find good weather here. And in St. Petersburg I was giving a talk about web performance, which is something I'm really passionate about, and it's something I will talk to anyone for hours. And this talk, which is called Where Are the Women, is actually inspired by my journey into web performance. So a few years back, before I was a jobbing developer, I went to a meetup, my first ever web performance meetup. Coincidentally, it was hosted at the Financial Times. This is way before I worked for them. And I was a little bit late, so I walked into the room. There were like maybe 50, 60 people, so the room was full. I sat down at the back and I lifted my gaze, and this is what I noticed. The English word is sausage fest, so you don't need a lot of imagination to understand what that means. And it was a strange experience for me because I was new to it and I had a lot of questions, and it was an interesting talk about progressive web apps, which at the time was quite new. And I felt that all my questions were stupid and I couldn't really ask anything, and I didn't know anyone, and everybody seemed like they knew each other, so I couldn't really network. I was too shy to do that afterwards because I simply didn't see anyone who was like me in the room. And it's made me ask myself, where are the women? And this sort of thing keeps happening to me. So I went to various panels. Latest one I think was an IETF panel on Quick, which is a transport, super exciting thing developed by Google. And I was the only woman in the room, and someone tweeted a photo of me. And then someone else was outraged on Twitter that I was the only woman in the room, and somehow this conversation was happening without actually involving me about the object in the room. It's really weird. Yeah, where are the women? Because this never happens. This has never happened to me. And maybe I got you wondering why it should happen, because after all, there's so many badass women at this conference from the Spanish-speaking community and beyond. It was really amazing for me to watch a previous talk, or the whole cinema was full, and it was just so captivating. There was a woman speaker, and I was super happy about that. And I also work with quite a few badass women. So I'm tech lead at the FT. I'm tech leading a couple of projects. I used to be on FT.com, where I was also tech leads. My career is in a really good place now, and I owe that to mentors like my principal engineer, who is a Hispanic woman, and we also have 2 female technical directors, and the head of cybersecurity is a woman. And I work on a really diverse engineering team as well, which is made up of 3 women and 1 person of color and someone who's a Twitter celebrity. So what is my problem? My problem is that I am white and I'm young and I'm a woman and I was born a woman and I'm a European citizen, and I can marry whoever I want and I don't have to show my key card to enter my apartment building, which was something that happened in the news 4 weeks ago in the States. And I didn't get asked to balance a binary search tree at immigration when I went to Russia, which is what happened to a Nigerian developer who went to the States. I'm living the dream, but not everybody is as lucky as I am, because today still someone's skin color and race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, age, even geography and class, they can give them more or fewer opportunities for success. And some people just have to work 10 times as hard as others to get to the same place. And I'm privileged enough to be here and have this stage to talk to you today about why that is and how you and I can help. But first, I'd like to tell you a story. So, story of how I became a developer. Let's go back to 2017. So Donald Trump's the new president of the United States, and England's just decided to divorce the European Union. And in my own country, which is Romania, there are the most widespread protests since the fall of communism because Romania is corrupt. So like, my future is a bit geographically uncertain. So I decided to take a risk and just do what I've always wanted to do, which is try and write code for a living, because I was a technical product owner before that, and I had a number of other jobs not really related to tech. And I took a chance, and I was in equal parts happy and absolutely terrified when the FT gave me a job about a year and a half ago, because I'd been coding for a while, and then I joined and I felt like I knew nothing. And then about a few weeks later, something happened. A Google employee called James Damore wrote an internal memo, like a manifesto, and it was leaked. And among other things, James Damore argued that the psychological and physiological differences between men and women explain why there are fewer female software engineers and why women are less likely to succeed in tech. So now I was already feeling like an imposter, and this memo and a lot of the internet discussion around it just made everything so much worse. And it made me realize that the tech industry can be an unwelcoming place for a lot of people. But they say that every cloud has a silver lining, and James Damore's memo got everyone talking about diversity. And it managed to highlight very publicly how our industry is still pretty homogenous and exclusive. And it's like everyone found out overnight and started arguing about it all over the internet. And this was a good thing. And I tuned into this conversation because I wanted to understand why we can't just all agree on something that is so clearly going to make the world a better place, which is to fix this imbalance in opportunity in tech. And, from here on, I just started listening to all sides of the debate. And first of all, I noticed that people talk about numbers a lot. So I'm going to start with the Financial Times. I love working at the Financial Times, and it is my experience that we value an environment that feels safe for everyone. But how diverse are we really? So globally, the FT actually employ slightly more women than we do men. At board level, female representation is 36%, which is still well above the European average. And by 2022, the FT have committed to reaching gender parity in the senior leadership teams. So that means 50-50. So that means like a lot of larger companies around the world, the FT have something that is called a diversity quota or diversity targets. And people have very strong feelings about these targets. Right? The prevailing argument is that they are inherently anti-meritocratic, and because it seems random and unfair to have these numeric requirements for hiring and promoting people based on their race or gender. And I've also read many variants of, I was hired because I'm a woman, and there are some accusations, they were hired because of diversity policy, and all of this is quite toxic. But personally, I have two problems with diversity quotas. And the first one is that they could make it seem like diversity is just a side project of your HR team and nobody else has any responsibility. And secondly, and I think this is the biggest flaw, is that quotas can trick us into thinking that our work is done once we've hit a target. So like, okay, boom, we fixed inequality because we've got these numbers. And I wish it were that simple. So let me give you an example. This is one of my favorite TV shows. I don't know if people recognize it from the intro. It's called Mad Men, and it's an American TV show about an ad agency called Sterling Cooper, set in like late 50s, early 60s. And Sterling Cooper have gender parity. Every high-powered ad man has a secretary. So, you can't take a company's diversity statistics at face value. You always have to ask extra questions to find out how the balance really tips. Like the question I always ask is, so what's your gender pay gap? Because in the UK, like 9 out of 10 women work for a company that pays them less for the same job, and half of men work for companies where the gender pay gap is more than 10% in their favour. So don't make the mistake of thinking that enforcing these quotas is enough to ensure fairness and equality, because it isn't. Quotas are flawed. It's important to recognise that. But before you dismiss them completely, just ask yourself if we live in a society where privilege plays no part in opportunity. If today merit truly equals effort and ability. And the answer to both those questions is no. And as long as that's true, then diversity quotas may be the only way of achieving a world where they're obsolete. They're just the means to an end we need. So, we tend to talk a lot about women and men and gender balances, and this is intentional on my part so far. We do this because we spent thousands of years shaping and rationalizing gender roles, but it's like 2018 now, and the conversation needs to shift. Because demographics aren't binary, they're a spectrum. And if you argue about diversity along one dimension or another, like just gender, then you're fighting for a kind of diversity that unequally benefits one group of people over another. And you're also ignoring what it means to be at the challenges at the intersection of, say, being a woman and a person with a disability, or being a person of color and non-binary. The kind of diversity worth fighting for is about more people from different races and cultures and different walks of life, and people of all abilities, or any or no gender, rubbing shoulders from VC pitches to fashion shows and startup incubators. And the kind of diversity that I want to fight for should mean that one day working class kids don't have to get working class jobs, and maybe more of us can lead lives free of discrimination and stigma. The kind of diversity worth fighting for is intersectional. What does that mean to us? How is our understanding of that reflected in tech? So, if you Google, why is diversity important in tech, you will come across hundreds of articles. I mean, the first 3 pages are almost solidly along the same tune, which is, diversity is good for tech because it's good for business. And there's a lot of data from recent research from major consultancies like BCG and Deloitte that show conclusively that diverse companies are more profitable and more productive and more innovative. And conversely, there is other research that shows that companies with the least diverse leadership are 25% more likely to have financial returns below their industry medians. This was found by McKinsey recently, and that's a huge number if you're into economics. Statistics like that are really good for getting your executives to buy into diversity initiatives. But this quote always comes to mind, and a colleague of mine said this: it's good for business is also the line you give to people who are so disinterested in making the world a better place for anyone but themselves that it's good for business is all you have. And it's good for business has little influence over my opinion and your opinion. And it's not really my battle cry in fighting for the diversity problem, because it doesn't help with fixing unfairness and equality, and it won't build a diverse workplace or a diverse community from the ground up. And also, it's super boring. I'm going to quote the same immensely quotable colleague, because as someone outside of your company, I don't care if it needs me or people like me to be better itself. So, for me, caring about diversity requires a moral argument that acknowledges inequity, because we live in a society where there's systemic inequality in access to education, access to employment, and we have persistent stereotypes about race and gender, wealth, ability, social class, and our institutions themselves, anything from education to politics, come with unequal outcomes built in, and these benefit some people more than others, and that's a fact. And if you think about it, diversity statistics from, minorities in politics to women in secondary education are a good barometer for social justice and equality. And the more people understand this, the better a chance for society itself to change. And, ignorance is part of the oppression. So I'm really glad we're all here listening to my talk. And no one can argue with this. No one can argue with a moral argument for diversity. Nobody actually will. Okay, maybe like bad people or ignorant people, but we're all good people here. And because we're good people, we're going to educate ourselves about what we can do to fix the diversity problem, because we acknowledge that it perpetuates this injustice and is also perpetuated by injustice. Except sometimes good people like you and me say and do things not for their intrinsic value, but because of what they say about us. This is something called virtue signaling. And a lot of what happens on social media, like especially Twitter, is virtue signaling. It's about showing off how right you are, that you care about the right things. I care about the right things. I shout about the wrongs in the world. And there's, I give a shit. And there's a lot of this self-congratulating focus on diversity, and it usually comes from a position of privilege. And it's unhelpful. And it's often so noisy that we fail to notice that perhaps the progress we've made is not enough, or that our implementation is slipping. So you can't be naive and idealistic about this, because the space between caring and not giving a shit is in the follow-up. And purpose is nothing without considerate implementation. You need more than purpose to create change. So find your own reason to care. I like to frame things from a selfish perspective. That really helps me. So most of us are invested in enriching our own lives, but we don't live in a void. This richness comes from the world around us, from gaining something called cognitive diversity, which is diversity of thought and experience. And this is something most of us strive for as individuals through our pursuits in life and our quest for knowledge and the connections we make with people, the experiences we look for. And compared to everything else, if you think about it, we spend a lot of time at work for a significant part of our lives. We come to trust our colleagues, and we form these implicit circles of trust, and we come to rely on one another to solve problems and generate ideas and make decisions and socialize together. And we turn to our bosses for support and direction, and usually we're really grateful to receive that support. And in turn, we offer our support to others, at work and beyond, and we give emotional support, and we make friends, and we create cliques. So we're natural networkers. We create these informal social networks through which we gain cognitive diversity, through which we diversify our knowledge, thought, and experience. And these informal networks are something called cognitive social structures. And cognitive social structures have been studied widely since the 90s, and much like other kinds of network structures, we now have established frameworks to analyze them. So I was reading up on cognitive social structures and their associated field called organizational network analysis. And I came across a really interesting study in the Harvard Business Review, which is available for free, and I'd encourage you to look it up. And this survey was underpinned by network data collected from a large professional services organization. And network data came from asking every employee questions like, with 1 day of training, whose job could you step into? Or who do you trust to discuss a work-related issue? Or who can you go to if you want to make a proposal that might receive opposition? So all of these questions would result in an answer that was another employee's name, and that's how you create network data. And the researchers mapped the connections between people onto directed graphs. And really, all these directed graphs represented various kinds of informal networks. And most interestingly, the researchers also color-coded all the vertices and edges with binary gender. And they made these visualizations about men versus women. And this gave me an idea. And I decided to run a few simulations in D3 of what informal networks might look like if we were to apply the FT's senior leadership team 36, 64 gender split. Yeah, so I just picked one for illustration purposes. Anyway, in a directed graph, all vertices have something called in degrees and out degrees, which mean the number of edges that are coming into or respectively out of each vertex. And the first thing I looked at is what would happen if we ordered the degrees of all these vertices in these graphs in descending or ascending order. This is called something called a degree sequence. And the degree sequence of my first few random simulations didn't really surprise me. So I don't know if you can guess where this is going, but okay, I'm going to try to illustrate. So for argument's sake, let's imagine that our senior leadership team needs to make an important decision, and you get to pick an orange node anywhere for our CTO, who is male, and then try and traverse the graph and ask yourself, how many women are going to be involved in any given decision-making chain? So yeah, my findings echoed the study, way less women. And you're going to say, yeah, but it's obvious because there's fewer women than men. But there's something else going on here. If you look at the diagram in the middle, this is the innovation or idea sharing network studied in Harvard Business Review research. And it had 22% more ties between members of the same gender than would be expected if we weren't giving any consideration to gender. And also women are less central than men, and they're completely absent from some areas, and they have fewer incoming connections. And this essentially means that fewer people come to seek them out to discuss new ideas. So the hypothesis is that even if you have as many women as men, you still have a disproportionate ratio of same gender ties. Why is that? Like, if you're building a house and diversity is bricks, the thing that glues it all together, the mortar, is something called inclusion. And we, by virtue of our human nature, are really awful at being inclusive because we tend to gravitate towards people like us. This is called the Similarity Bias. And it means that we instinctively hold back in building relationships with people who perceive are different from us. And we judge the others more harshly. And we have a lot of other biases and blind spots about people who are different from us. And these lead to exclusion and often self-exclusion. And then minority groups tend to conform. It's often just to cope or to avoid being stereotyped, but they end up de-emphasizing their otherness and adopting the traits of the majority. Think about, female investment bankers, if you've met any, or, TV show Suits, which is about a law firm. This is quite prevalent in male-dominated industries. And it happens because as a society we portray the majority as a prototype for success. And that means that we're effectively denying others the right to belong. So people from minority groups are either assimilated or excluded. And if it comes to actively including others, the people in the majority group will often put up resistance because they feel excluded from diversity initiatives and they feel reverse favoritism. So yeah, underrepresented groups face all sorts of bias, and they face stereotype threats, and they face empathy gaps, and they have ambition gaps, and day in and day out they're bombarded with all these negative societal cues which get internalized, and these things wear you down. So it's no wonder that for minorities, opportunity doesn't necessarily translate into professional achievement, because just think about it. Okay, your career progression depends on taking risks and advocating for yourself. And taking risks and advocating for yourself is not at the forefront of your mind when you're just grateful that you're allowed to be there. Because if diversity is being invited to the party, then inclusion is being glad you're there. So in other words, there's not much good in having diversity without inclusion, and this probably seems like an obvious point by now, but diversity plus inclusion equals like a happy, vibrant, welcoming developer community for all, and diversity plus inclusion also equals a safe place to work. but is that really obvious to all of us in tech? So I've tried to make a diagram here of the Stack Overflow developer survey, which this year asked developers how they evaluate potential jobs. And 30.4%, which is a vast majority of respondents, said that diversity was their lowest priority. And then different types of developers have different priorities when considering jobs. So gender minorities rank company culture and the office environment at the top of their list. And the other 90-something% of respondents rank how much they're getting paid the highest. So we haven't even got the basics right. This Stack Overflow developer survey made me quite sad, and I hope it's an eye-opener for everyone. But let's not emigrate to the moon just yet, because I'm going to try and answer the obvious question, which is how. How are we going to break down these barriers that stand in the way of creating a more diverse and more inclusive community, and more diverse and more inclusive tech industry for everyone? And, we can start by admitting that there are things in our power that we can and should be doing, and by acknowledging our collective and individual responsibility to make things better. And there's no magic wand or quick fix, but there's a few things that you can do right now. You can start by resolving to do no harm. So just, try and be kinder, more compassionate, and stop and think before you speak and act. And to do no harm, you have to start by understanding your own biases, because we're all biased. I'm biased. And, size up your privilege, like I did in the beginning of this talk, and keep that in check. Be aware of it at all times. And neither of these things are easy or obvious, and they require a lot of introspection, which is hard, and a lot of honesty with yourself, which is even harder, and research, which is on the internet. You can use a website called Project Implicit to find out your implicit associations about race and gender and sexual orientation and other topics, and I really recommend doing this exercise. Second of all, hire people, like people who care about people and diversity and inclusion, fixing this problem, and hire them from underrepresented groups, which I'm sure you've heard before, and it's super hard, and you're going to meet with a lot of opposition. Because there's always someone that says, oh yeah, diversity is important, but we can't lower the bar. This bar is bullshit. It comes from a consensus that was established from a privileged position that's held by a long time by the same majority of people who are part of the problem, right? Not the solution. Interestingly, last year there was an internal survey by Google that found zero relationship between an interviewer saying hire and the candidate actually being a good or bad hire. And that means that no one in tech actually has a bar that works very well in determining good versus bad hires, regardless of their gender or ethnicity. And maybe someone will say, not enough minorities are applying. This is what we call the pipeline problem. They're just not coming to us. Gotta ask yourself why, and then fix it. And a good place to start with that is job descriptions. So, leave out stuff like no ninja, and we have beer pong. And maybe you have a long list of bullet point requirements, and it feels natural, but you have to understand that these lists implicitly select for the majority, and that the majority will apply when they meet a lower proportion of criteria. Studies show that that's around 60% of criteria is enough for someone who's a majority to apply, when people from underrepresented groups will only apply if they meet most or all of your criteria. And there are tools out there. Something I've tried is Textio, and Textio helps you analyze your job descriptions for obvious points of improvement, like using more inclusive language and rooting out the more basic problems. But always apply empathy and really try and consult someone from an underrepresented group, a woman, anyone, and try and get some feedback on those job descriptions. Okay, maybe you don't have job descriptions with bullet points and stuff. Maybe you're more interested in someone's GitHub, or like their open source contributions, or their blog, or their public speaking. So yeah, how many single mom engineers do you think you're gonna hire with that approach? Your job is to build the best team. I mean, you can use any number of strategies to get there, but ultimately, if your strategy is to just hire the best candidate for the role, and you don't think about the team's composition, and it leaves you with a weaker and less diverse team in the end, then that strategy is failing, and it's got to change. You have to reach out to underrepresented groups. You can't just expect them to show up, right? We're not used to that. You have to actively seek people out. And, for example, if you don't know where to start with gender minorities in tech, try Twitter. It's full of us. And you have to support and nurture people. And you have to remember that minorities have to prove themselves to a far greater extent than everybody else. So studies show that men are promoted based on potential, and women are promoted based on past achievements. You can't just hire people and let them get on with it. Either you have to have their backs and do that throughout their career, and be a mentor and give them opportunities as they grow. And then you have to advocate for others, and then take that time to give recognition. And if you have a platform like I do today, you have to shout about the triumphs of minorities in tech to really make a change. In other words, become an ally. All of us can be allies for each other. And you can do that by building up your empathy and your social intelligence, and getting comfortable with tampons and pronouns, and learning the language that we use to talk about disability, religion, ethnicity, and sexual orientation, because this really matters to people. So if you don't know, just ask and listen, and become part of the solution by supporting minorities in the workforce and outside and at home. Like, be an equal parent, be a better partner. I'm going to bring up Tampon Club. So Tampon Club is founded by one of my colleagues, and it is just an initiative. It's very open source. It's a group of people leaving tampons and sanitary towels in workplace toilets, because you always need them, so that they're available when they're required. And you know what? Just put them in both toilets. Maybe someone's transitioning. Just leave no one out, no matter their gender, ability, race, or social class. Notice and really see those who are around you, and look for those who are missing and should be around you. And treat everyone with the same respect and compassion, also without prejudice. You have to actively and consciously build and maintain inclusive workplaces, and inclusive conferences, and inclusive meetups, and inclusive panels, and inclusive working groups. It doesn't just happen naturally. You have to use inclusive language. Don't say guys. Don't use ableist language. And code inclusive forms. Leave out the radio buttons with male, female, other, and consider those who don't drink beer at meetups. And just try and be a little bit more compassionate. And speak up, because silence serves no one. And especially speak up when others can't, because maybe they lack the confidence or seniority to demand that a problem be fixed. And don't be afraid to call out bad attitudes and behaviors on their behalf. Do what you do if you weren't afraid, because we stand on the shoulders of those who came before us, and now it's on us to create a change. So be bold and aim for the top, where you can influence people. And that's super scary. And it involves getting rid of any internal barriers. And that's critical to gaining power and social impact. And it's entirely up to you to do that. But be your true self. Refuse to be someone that you're not. And don't worry if you're uncomfortable. Like, that's okay. It's okay to be awkward, and it's okay to feel little confidence. But breaking down these internal barriers helps create psychological safety for those around you. So it's crucial that you try and do it. And if you're a minority, don't just accept the status quo or get complacent. So yeah, I see things like these on Twitter a lot. I must have written about 3 bios. I fit all your quotas. This is funny, but it's not really helpful. It's not really doing anything. Take responsibility for your words. And do that, especially as you get further in your career and you gain more influence, because people will listen. So use that privilege to support and boost those who need it most. And you can help normalize allyship. Because if you're a person with privilege, it's much easier for you to advocate for allies. Listen to people. Pay close attention to marginalized voices and give them your full attention, and don't interrupt. Echo and attribute what you hear. And make sure you have access to a broad range of views. So an easy place to start if you're on Twitter is diversify your feed. And this is a website that tells you how gender balanced your Twitter is and makes recommendations of whom to follow based on the topics you're interested in. It's really cool. Yeah, making sure you have access to a broad range of views isn't just something you can do online. You can do that offline, but you have to get out of your comfort zone and make new connections and make new friends. Diversify your social media and your social circles to broaden your perspective, but do so with intention and mindfulness. Something we have at the FT is a Slack bot called Donut. And Donut is really amazing, and I'd encourage everyone to try it out. Donut recommends people you've never met before for a 30-minute coffee break, at a frequency you can control. For me, it's once every 2 weeks. For others who are more busy, it's once a month. It's absolutely amazing. Make the effort. You have to make the effort to get to know what others are going through. But you can't make assumptions because you're not a savior. This is a really interesting thing for me to understand when a new colleague joined my team, and he joined us from coding bootcamp for refugees. He's an Ethiopian refugee, and I had to sort of bite my lip to not ask the obvious questions that were pressing me. And to make sure that he's welcome on the team without any prejudice. Yeah, maybe instead of making assumptions, join some support groups. That's a great way to get to know the struggles some of us are facing. Or start some support groups if there aren't any in your company. And celebrate diversity. Make it a really inclusive party for all of us in tech, and hold yourself and hold your team accountable for creating this change. Because tolerating difference is not the same as embracing it. Tweet the slide. It's the really important one. Thank you, that was me. Any questions?